The polished brown combat boots of Rear Admiral Harrison tapped an impatient rhythm on the rain-dampened concrete of Marine Corps Base Quantico. The air, thick with the scent of pine and aviation fuel, was electric with anticipation for the Marine Aviation Squadron's annual dedication ceremony. Hundreds of Marines in their crisp dress blue uniforms, families clutching miniature Marine Corps flags, and a host of distinguished guests formed a sea of patriotic fervor. But the Admiral's cold gray eyes were fixed on one person. A single disruption in his perfectly orchestrated event. The unassuming female security guard at the screening station. "I don't have time for this," he clipped, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum. "This is General Martinez. His credentials are unimpeachable. Your scanner is faulty. Let him pass." The woman, dressed in a simple navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants, didn't flinch. She held up a hand, not in defiance, but in a gesture of calm procedure. "Sir, with all due respect, protocol requires a visual confirmation from the command post. If the digital scan fails, it will only take a moment." Harrison's face hardened, a storm gathering in his features. The crowd closest to the exchange fell silent. The woman wasn't being rude, but in the Admiral's world, a civilian contractor telling him to wait was an intolerable act of insubordination. He saw her not as a professional, but as an obstacle. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant for her alone, but loud enough for a dozen others to hear. "Your job is to facilitate, not obstruct. Now, step aside, or I will have you removed from this base permanently." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. The woman simply stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, waiting for the confirmation to come through her earpiece. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Her name was Elena Martinez, though everyone on the security roster just knew her as E. At 42, she was a quiet fixture at the Marine base, a woman who seemed to blend into the background by design. She was of average height and build with watchful green eyes, and auburn hair usually pulled back in a neat, functional bun. She spoke only when necessary, and her movements were economical, efficient, and imbued with a peculiar stillness that some of her younger colleagues mistook for timidness. The base was a world of rigid hierarchies, of gleaming metals and starched uniforms, a place where rank was everything. He wore none. She was a civilian contractor, a ghost in the machine, and to figures like Rear Admiral Harrison, she was effectively invisible until she got in the way. The whispers among the junior officers and enlisted personnel were varied. Some found her oddly intense, noting how her eyes never stopped scanning, cataloging details others missed. Others just saw a lonely woman doing a thankless job, someone who probably had a quiet life in a small apartment somewhere in town. They underestimated her. They saw her slight, almost imperceptible limp when she walked her long patrols as a weakness. They interpreted her silence as a lack of confidence. They saw her simple uniform and thought her simple-minded. What they couldn't see was the iron discipline that held her posture straight, or the profound depth of experience that lay behind her placid expression. Her presence was a study in contrasts. She was soft-spoken yet firm, reserved yet relentlessly observant. In the mornings, she was always the first to arrive, her locker organized with military precision. Her lunch was always the same, a simple sandwich and an apple. She never participated in station house gossip, preferring to read a worn paperback novel during her breaks. The book's cover was gone, its pages softened by countless readings. On her wrist, she wore a single plain silver bracelet tarnished with age. It was a small personal detail in an otherwise Spartan existence, a silent testament to a life lived outside the confines of the Marine base. But no one ever asked about it. No one ever asked about her past at all. To them, she was simply E, the quiet guard at the gate, a footnote in the grand, bustling story of the United States Marine Corps. And that, it seemed, was exactly how she preferred it. The conflict with Rear Admiral Harrison wasn't a sudden storm. It had been building for weeks. Harrison was a man forged in the crucible of naval tradition, a surface warfare officer who believed in loud commands and unwavering obedience. He saw the world in black and white, uniform and civilian, order and chaos. A civilian who operated with the quiet authority of a seasoned NCO, was a gray area he couldn't tolerate. The first significant clash occurred a month prior during a security review for an upcoming visit from a foreign dignitary. In a crowded briefing room, he had raised her hand. When called upon, she spoke in her usual measured tone. "Admiral, the proposed route for the motorcade has a significant blind spot between the armory and Hangar 4. The surveillance tower there has a restricted line of sight for nearly 200 yards." Harrison had stared down at her from the podium, his expression one of pure condescension. He looked at the base's uniformed security chief. "Is this true?" The chief, a Marine Master Sergeant, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, technically yes, but we deem the risk to be minimal." Harrison cut him off, his gaze returning to E. "The risk is minimal," he repeated as if speaking to a child. He then addressed the entire room. "Let's leave the strategic analysis to the people who actually wear the uniform, shall we?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the assembled officers. He simply nodded, her face betraying no emotion as she sat down. But the base security chief later quietly altered the route, vindicating her observation without ever acknowledging it publicly. The second incident was more personal. Harrison was jogging his usual 5-mile loop around the base perimeter when he saw E meticulously inspecting the chain-link fence near the back gate. She was running her fingers along the tension wire, her focus absolute. He slowed to a stop, sweating and irritated. "Everything to your satisfaction, contractor?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The wire is showing signs of corrosion near this post, sir," she replied without looking up. "And the ground here is softer than the surrounding area. It could be a potential breach point." Harrison scoffed. "I've been running this perimeter for 10 years. The fence is fine. Get back to your post and stop inventing problems." He ran off, leaving her there. The next day, a work order was anonymously submitted to base maintenance to shore up that exact section of fence. The problem was fixed, but the Admiral's disdain for her only grew. He saw her competence not as an asset, but as a silent challenge to his authority. This brought them to the dedication ceremony, the culmination of his animosity. After being forced to wait for the credential confirmation, which of course proved incorrect and exposed a clerical error on the general's paperwork, Harrison was seething. He saw her not just as an irritant, but as a source of public embarrassment. He was determined to put her in her place. As the ceremony prepared to get underway, a group of distinguished guests arrived late. They were a unit of Marine Recon just back from a harsh deployment in the Pacific Theater, their desert tans a stark contrast to the Marine dress blues. They were there to receive a unit citation. As they approached the checkpoint, now being manned by a different guard, Admiral Harrison saw his chance. He strode over to E, who was now directing foot traffic away from the VIP seating area. He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to halt. The crowd, sensing a confrontation, began to watch from the corners of their eyes. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," Harrison began, his voice dangerously low. "Your job is to be seen and not heard. You are a civilian, a temporary employee. You do not have the authority to delay a 2-star admiral, and you certainly do not have the authority to direct personnel on my base." The laughter that had followed his earlier comments was gone. Now there were only whispers. The Marines and their families looked on, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. What would you have done if you were in her shoes, facing down a powerful man's fury in front of hundreds of people? He simply met his gaze. "My apologies, Admiral. I was ensuring a clear path for the honor guard." Her calm, respectful tone only seemed to incense him further. "I give the orders here. Your contract is with base security, but your presence on this plaza is at my discretion, and right now my discretion is telling me you are a liability. I want you off this plaza. Now report to your supervisor and inform him you've been removed from duty. Is that understood?" The public humiliation was absolute. He wasn't just reprimanding her. He was firing her in front of everyone. The whispers died, replaced by a shocked, heavy silence. As Elena Martinez turned to comply with the Admiral's brutal order, a gust of wind from the nearby airfield whipped across the plaza. It caught the sleeve of her navy blue polo shirt, pushing it up past her elbow for just a moment. For the few people standing close enough to see, the sight was jarring. Snaking up her forearm was a thick, jagged scar, a lattice of puckered, discolored skin that spoke of a violent, traumatic injury. It wasn't the clean line of surgical incision. It was the chaotic signature of shattered metal or a high-impact wound. A nearby chief petty officer, a man who had seen his share of combat injuries in Fallujah, instinctively recognized it for what it was. He frowned, his eyes narrowing in thought. That was no kitchen accident. He quickly pulled her sleeve down, her movements fluid and practiced, but the image was seared into the minds of those who saw it. As she began her walk of shame away from the VIP section, she passed a Marine gunnery sergeant standing guard near the ceremonial stage. Her head was held high, her posture betraying none of the humiliation she must have felt. As she passed, her collar shifted slightly. For a split second, the gunny saw the edge of tattoo on her upper back just below her neckline. It wasn't a flower or a quote. It was two sharply angled black ink lines, the unmistakable tips of a raptor's talons. It was a familiar predatory symbol often associated with elite aviation units. He knew he'd seen it before, but the context was wrong. What was a design like that doing on a civilian security guard? Meanwhile, the late arriving Marine recon were being processed through the checkpoint. Their leader, a tall captain with the quiet, lethal grace of a lifelong warrior, watched E walk away. He saw the Admiral's smug expression and the pitying looks from the crowd, but he was focused on the woman herself. He watched the way she walked, the disciplined economy of her movements, the straightness of her back. Even with the slight limp, she moved with a purpose that was deeply familiar to him. He squinted, a flash of recognition sparking in his mind. He leaned over to his master sergeant, a grizzled veteran with a chest full of medals. "Chief," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Take a look at that woman. The one the Admiral is chasing off." The master sergeant's eyes followed his gaze. "The security guard. Yeah, tough break." "No," the captain said, his voice tense with dawning realization. "Look at her. Really look. Have you ever seen her before?" The master sergeant studied her for a moment longer and shook his head. The captain's eyes remained locked on E's retreating form. He whispered a single word, a name, not Elena, but a call sign, a designation spoken with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Ghost." Just as Elena was about to pass the last row of spectators and disappear from view, a sudden, piercing screech of tortured metal ripped through the air. A heavy-duty sound system tower positioned precariously on a mobile lift near the main stage had suffered a critical hydraulic failure. With a sickening lurch, the entire structure began to topple, its multi-ton weight arcing directly towards a section of bleachers filled with Marines, families, and children. Panic erupted. A collective scream went up from the crowd as people scrambled to get away. Uniformed personnel, including Admiral Harrison, froze for a critical second, their minds struggling to process the unfolding disaster. It was in that split second of chaos that Elena Martinez transformed. The quiet, unassuming security guard vanished. In her place stood a commander. Her voice, no longer soft or measured, exploded with a power that defied her frame. It was a voice forged in the roar of jet engines and the crucible of life or death decisions. "Brace and cover," she bellowed, the command cutting through the panic like a razor. It was not a suggestion. It was an order imbued with absolute instinctual authority. As people instinctively dropped or shielded their loved ones, she moved. Her limp was gone, replaced by a ruthlessly efficient stride. She didn't run from the danger. She ran parallel to it, her eyes calculating the trajectory of the falling tower with a pilot's spatial awareness. "VIPs against the bulkhead. Stage right," she yelled, pointing towards the solid steel wall of a nearby aircraft hangar. Her directions were precise, unambiguous, and immediate. she saw two young Marines standing paralyzed with fear and pointed directly at them. "You two get the children clear now. Use that maintenance corridor." Her finger jabbed toward an access way no one else had even noticed. The Marines, jolted out of their stupor by the sheer force of her command, immediately complied, their training kicking in as they began herding families to safety. The sound tower crashed to the ground with a deafening boom, its metal arms smashing into the bleachers just seconds after the last family had scrambled clear. It landed exactly where she had anticipated. The immediate danger was over, but the plaza was in chaos. Through it all, everyone from the rawest Marine recruit to Admiral Harrison himself had simply watched, utterly dumbfounded. The woman he had just publicly fired and dismissed as a rent-a-cop had just taken decisive command of a mass casualty situation, assessed the threat, issued clear orders, and coordinated an evacuation in the space of about 5 seconds. She had moved with a level of tactical competence and chilling composure that most career officers spend a lifetime trying to achieve. The Marine Recon team, who had been moving to assist, stopped and watched her work. They didn't see a civilian contractor. They saw a fellow operator, a professional, moving with an expert's deadly grace. The captain's suspicion hardened into certainty. He knew exactly who he was looking at. The legend was real. As the dust settled and the initial shock wore off, a stunned silence fell over the plaza. Base personnel and first responders began to move in, but the immediate crisis had been averted, thanks entirely to the swift actions of one woman. Admiral Harrison stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. He looked at the mangled heap of metal, at the now safe families, and then at Elena Martinez, who was calmly checking on a small child who had fallen during the scramble. The Marine Recon captain didn't wait for an invitation. He strode purposefully through the stunned crowd, his path unwavering. He walked past junior officers, past decorated colonels, and directly past the still frozen Admiral Harrison. He stopped about 3 feet in front of E, his entire team falling in a formation behind him. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her with a profound professional respect. He noted the scar on her arm, now clearly visible, and the intense focus in her eyes. The authority she had just projected still lingered around her like an aura. Admiral Harrison, finally regaining his voice, marched over, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "What in the world is going on here, Captain? Who is this woman?" The Marine captain never took his eyes off E. His voice was quiet, yet it carried with perfect clarity across the silent plaza. "Admiral," he began, his tone laced with a deference that was somehow also a rebuke. "I think you know who she is. You just don't know what she is." He then turned his head slightly to face the Admiral. "Sir, with all due respect, you are addressing Captain Elena Martinez, United States Marine Corps, retired." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. A Marine captain here working as a security guard. It made no sense. The captain let the title sink in before delivering the final earth-shattering piece of the puzzle. He looked back at E, his expression one of pure reverence. "Her call's sign," he said, his voice dropping an octave filled with the weight of legend, "is Ghost." The name hit the air and seemed to hang there shimmering and deadly. For the aviators and special operators in the crowd, the name was mythological. Ghost wasn't just any pilot. Captain Ghost Martinez was a whispered story of one of the first and most decorated female AV-8B Harrier pilots. A pioneer who flew clandestine missions over hostile skies. A pilot with more confirmed combat hours in the jump jet than almost anyone. A recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for an action that was still classified. She had vanished from the service years ago after a catastrophic ejection that it was rumored had nearly torn her apart. They said she'd never walk again, let alone fly. And now here, she was in a security polo on a marine plaza. The silence was no longer shocked. It was sacred. Without another word, the Marine captain's back went ramrod straight. He brought his hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to slice the air. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a superior officer. It was the salute a warrior gives to a hero. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it is an absolute honor." The captain's salute acted as a signal. Instantly, his entire team of hardened Marine recon snapped to attention, their hands cracking against their brows in perfect unified respect. The sound echoed in the stillness. The Marine gunnery sergeant who had seen the Harrier-Talon tattoo finally understood. The symbol belonged to the AV-8B community. His posture straightened, and he executed a flawless salute of his own. Across the plaza, the chain reaction was immediate and overwhelming. An Army colonel, a guest of the new squadron's commander, saluted. The Air Force veterans in the crowd, men and women who had only heard stories of the legendary Ghost, came to attention, their eyes wide with disbelief and awe. Then the Marines themselves began to salute, from the young lance corporals on crowd control duty to the grizzled sergeants major. A wave of respect washed over the assembly. The sea of dress blues became a forest of salutes, all directed at the quiet woman in the khaki pants. They weren't saluting a security guard. They were saluting a warrior who had walked out of the sky and was standing among them. Rear Admiral Harrison was the last to move. He stood there utterly paralyzed, the world he knew having been turned completely upside down. The woman he had insulted, belittled, and publicly humiliated was a decorated combat veteran, a hero from a sister service whose reputation far outshone his own. The shame that washed over him was a physical force, hot and suffocating. He saw the hundreds of salutes, not as a challenge to his authority, but as a judgment of his character. Slowly, deliberately, as if lifting a great weight, Admiral Harrison raised his own hand to his brow. His salute was stiff, formal, and held far longer than protocol required. In that single silent gesture, he conveyed a profound and deeply felt apology, an admission of his own arrogance, and an offering of the highest respect he was capable of giving. The air on the plaza was thick with the unspoken truth. True honor is not demanded by rank, but commanded by courage. And in that moment, all the rank on the plaza belonged to the quiet woman in the security contractor's uniform. Elena "Ghost" Martinez did not revel in the moment. The sea of salutes, the silent, awe-filled stares, it all made her deeply uncomfortable. This was the exact kind of attention she had spent years avoiding. She held their gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, before giving the Marine captain a single brief nod. It was a gesture of mutual understanding and acknowledgement from one warrior to another, and it was all that was needed. As the salutes were lowered, Admiral Harrison approached her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine humility. His face was pale, his voice strained. "Captain Martinez," he began, stumbling over the name. "I don't know what to say. My conduct was inexcusable. There is no apology sufficient for the disrespect I've shown you." She looked at him, her green eyes holding no trace of malice or triumph. She saw not an admiral, but a man humbled by his own mistake. "We all have a job to do, Admiral," she said, her voice returning to its normal, quiet cadence. "Today mine was this checkpoint. That's all that matters. Please see to your guests." She then turned and began to help the first responders check on the families in the bleachers, her duty-minded focus immediately re-engaging. She was already moving on. The story of what happened on the plaza that day spread across Marine Corps Base Quantico like wildfire. It became a lesson whispered in briefing rooms and retold in mess halls. It was a story about the unassuming security guard who was once a legend in the sky. It was a powerful reminder that the greatest heroes are often the ones who seek no glory. The quiet professionals who continue to serve long after they have taken off the uniform. Captain Elena Martinez's story is not one of supernatural strength or impossible feats. It is a testament to the quiet dignity of service. It teaches us that courage isn't measured by the rank on a shoulder or the volume of voice. It's measured in the calm resolve to do the right thing. Whether you are flying a $100 million jump jet at the edge of space or simply standing your post at a gate, her life is a profound lesson to us all. Look beyond the surface. Honor the silent warriors who walk among us, and never ever underestimate the person standing the watch. The authentication had taken 45 seconds. Voice pattern analysis, biometric comparison to archived recordings, cross-reference with classified operational codes that only Ghost would know. Every check came back positive. Confirmed. Marine command transmitted. Ghost authenticated. Captain Martinez, you're cleared for emergency protocols. Elena had allowed herself the briefest smile after 5 years of hiding, of pretending to be dead. Her real identity was back. She turned her attention to the immediate problem, landing a crippled nation's trust. The quiet heroes, the ones who ask for nothing and give everything, are the true backbone of our nations. Their stories of sacrifice and silent strength deserve to be told, to be remembered, and to be honored. The morning briefing at Joint Expeditionary Base Norfolk was supposed to be routine. Another quarterly assessment. Another room full of senior officers discussing overseas operations while someone else handled the logistics. Someone expendable. Someone like Captain Elena Martinez. She didn't look like much walking into that plaza that Tuesday morning. Standard khaki security uniform. No unit patches visible. No colorful ribbons decorating her chest. Hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Not a strand out of place, but nothing that would catch anyone's attention either. She carried a radio under one arm and a clipboard in the other, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people assume she was exactly where she belonged in the background, handling the details nobody else wanted to deal with. The plaza was already buzzing with preparation when she slipped through the gate. 3 Marine colonels clustered around the ceremonial stage, pointing at seating charts spread across the temporary table. A pair of lieutenant colonels were reviewing guest manifests near the entrance. And at the far end, Admiral Harrison sat reviewing his notes with the focused intensity that had earned him 2 stars in command of fleet logistics. None of them looked up when Elena entered. Why would they? She moved along the perimeter of the plaza, checking security positions with practiced precision. Radio frequencies verified, backup protocols confirmed, emergency routes marked clearly in her mind, the kind of mundane preparation work that kept high-level ceremonies running smoothly while the important people focused on important things. Elena had done this dance before in plazas, just like this one for officers just like these. Elena had learned long ago that being underestimated was often the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. People told you things when they thought you didn't matter. They let their guard down when they assumed you were no threat. It was intelligence gathering of the most basic kind, and Elena had turned it into an art form. Her background was deliberately unremarkable on paper. Standard enlisted progression through the ranks, clean service record, competent but not exceptional performance reviews. The kind of military career that would never draw scrutiny from personnel reviewers or raise questions during security clearance investigations. Everything about Captain Elena Martinez suggested she was exactly what she appeared to be, a reliable, competent, utterly forgettable cog in the vast machinery of military logistics. But that was precisely the point. Most mornings, Elena could be found in the administrative offices of Building 247, handling security schedules and coordinating protocols for senior staff ceremonies. She knew which admiral preferred his briefings on paper versus digital displays, which colonel needed extra time to review operational summaries, and which officers could be counted on to show up late and need their materials reorganized on the fly. She was the person who made sure the radios worked, the plaza was properly secured, and the classified documents were distributed to the right people with the right security clearances. It was the kind of work that kept military ceremonies functioning smoothly while remaining completely invisible to the people who benefited from it. Elena liked it that way. Being essential but unnoticed gave her access to information and meetings that most people at her rank would never see. She could observe decision-making processes, understand command relationships, and maintain situational awareness without anyone questioning why she was always around when important conversations were happening. Today was different, though. Today, she was handling security for a ceremony that was several pay grades above her usual assignments. Marine Aviation Squadron Dedication, classified mission reviews, the kind of event where colonels and admirals discuss things that never made it into official reports. She'd arrived early to set everything up properly, checked the secure communications equipment, arranged the seating chart according to rank and security clearance, made sure all the classified materials were properly accounted for and locked in the appropriate safes until the ceremony began. By the time the first officers started arriving, everything was in perfect order, and Elena had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be to remain useful, but unnoticed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to provide security for a room full of officers planning operations she knew more about than they realized. But that was the game she'd chosen to play, and she'd gotten very good at it over the years. Being underestimated had served her well in situations far more dangerous than a Marine base ceremony. Elena straightened the last of the security barriers and glanced at her watch. Admiral Harrison would be arriving in 15 minutes, and she wanted everything perfect when he walked through that gate. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because attention to detail was a habit that had kept her alive in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. She checked her uniform one more time, making sure everything was in place, then took her position near the security checkpoint where she could monitor the ceremony without drawing attention to herself. In a few minutes, she'd become part of the furniture again, invisible and essential, exactly the way she preferred it. Admiral Marcus Harrison arrived exactly on schedule, which was 15 minutes early. You could hear him coming down the walkway before you saw him. Not because he was loud, but because everything about the man commanded attention. Sharp uniform with every ribbon and medal positioned with mathematical precision. Silver eagles gleaming under the morning light, and that particular way of walking that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and tactical thinking. He was the kind of admiral who'd earned his stars through fleet commands, not Pentagon politics. 2 tours in the Persian Gulf, 1 in the Pacific Theater, and enough classified operations that his official biography read like a heavily redacted document. The rumors said he'd personally led naval operations that most people would only hear about in Hollywood movies, but Harrison never talked about those days. He didn't need to. Everything about his bearing suggested a man who'd seen combat and come out the other side with his principles intact. When he walked into the ceremony plaza, the entire energy of the space shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Officers straightened in their chairs, and everyone suddenly looked like they were trying to appear more competent than they'd been 30 seconds earlier. Harrison had that effect on people, not through intimidation exactly, but through the kind of quiet authority that came from having made life and death decisions under pressure. He surveyed the plaza with the methodical attention of someone conducting a tactical assessment. His eyes swept across the ceremonial stage, the classified briefing materials, the assembled staff officers, taking inventory of everything and everyone present. When his gaze passed over Elena, standing quietly near the security checkpoint, it didn't linger. She was part of the background, exactly where she belonged in his mental map of the ceremony space. Admiral Harrison took his position at the head of the plaza and opened his briefing folder with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd been attending ceremonies like this one for longer than most of the other officers had been in the military. He was the senior man in the plaza, the final decision maker, the person everyone else would defer to when it came time to approve or reject the operational plans they were about to discuss. The ceremony began with the usual protocol. Colors presented, national anthem played, unit citations read with appropriate solemnity. Elena watched from her position, noting crowd flow patterns, monitoring radio frequencies, keeping track of VIP movement through the secured areas. It was routine work, the kind she could do in her sleep after years of practice. But she noticed things others missed. The way Admiral Harrison's jaw tightened when certain classified operations were mentioned. The way his eyes tracked movement around the plaza with the awareness of someone who'd learned to read threats in crowded spaces. The way he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all exits, a habit born from too many briefings in too many hostile environments. 20 minutes into the ceremony, Harrison glanced toward the security checkpoint and caught Elena's eye with a slight nod. She understood immediately, moving forward to check credentials for a late-arriving dignitary. It was a routine interaction, the kind of small service that happened dozens of times in ceremonies like this one. Elena approached the checkpoint professionally, waiting for the guest to present identification. She'd done this hundreds of times before in similar events, processing VIP credentials without disrupting the flow of important military business. But this time will be different. This time, something as simple as following security protocol would change everything about how everyone in that plaza saw Captain Elena Martinez. She just didn't know it yet. The moment Admiral Harrison nodded toward the security checkpoint, Elena moved forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd served in countless ceremonies just like this one. She approached the credential station during a natural pause in the proceedings, scanner in hand, ready to process the late-arriving dignitary without disrupting the flow of important military business. Colonel Martinez was in the middle of explaining aviation logistics schedules when Elena stepped up beside the checkpoint barrier. She could hear Colonel Thompson asking questions about maintenance coordination from across the plaza, but her focus was on the simple task at hand. Check credentials, verify clearance, maintain security. Harrison barely acknowledged her presence as she began the standard verification process. This was routine military courtesy, the kind of basic security that happened automatically in senior staff ceremonies. He continued reviewing the operational timelines spread across the table in front of him, his attention completely focused on the classified mission parameters Colonel Martinez was outlining. Elena lifted the credential scanner and began processing the dignitary's identification card. Her movements smooth and professional. She'd done this exact same action hundreds of times before in ceremonies, just like this one for officers just like him. There was nothing different about today. Nothing special about this particular moment that should have drawn anyone's attention. But when the scanner beeped with an error tone, indicating the credential needed manual verification, Elena paused and spoke the words that would change everything. "Sir, I need to get verbal confirmation from the command post before I can clear this credential. The scanner shows a verification error that requires additional authorization." It was standard protocol, the kind of thing that happened routinely when digital systems encounter database delays or connectivity issues. But Admiral Harrison's reaction was immediate and explosive. His head snapped up from the briefing materials, his face darkening with sudden fury. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the ceremonial proceedings like a blade. Elena remained calm, professional, exactly as she'd been trained. "Sir, standard protocol requires manual verification when the digital scanner indicates an authentication error. It will only take a moment to confirm with the command post." Harrison's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the briefing table. "I don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. Do you have any idea who I am? This is General Martinez. His credentials are beyond question. Your scanner is obviously malfunctioning." Elena didn't waver, didn't back down, didn't compromise security protocol despite the mounting pressure from a two-star admiral who clearly expected immediate compliance. "Sir, with respect, I understand the urgency, but security protocol doesn't make exceptions based on rank or assumed credentials. The verification will only take 30 seconds. Harrison's face went from red to purple. The plaza had gone silent now, all attention focused on the confrontation developing at the security checkpoint. Other officers watched with growing discomfort as their commanding officer's anger escalated over what should have been a routine administrative matter. "Your job," Harrison snarled, stepping closer to the barrier, "is to facilitate legitimate military business, not to obstruct it with petty rule following. I'm ordering you to clear this credential immediately." Elena met his glare without flinching, her voice remaining steady despite the public pressure. "Admiral, my job is to maintain base security according to established protocols. Those protocols exist for everyone's protection, including yours. The scanner has flagged this credential for additional verification. That's not a suggestion or a recommendation. It's a mandatory security requirement." The confrontation had now become a spectacle. with hundreds of ceremony attendees watching a two-star admiral being defied by a civilian security contractor who refused to bend protocol. Harrison's voice rose to a level that carried across the entire plaza, his words dripping with condescension and barely controlled rage. "Let me make something absolutely clear to you, contractor. I'm a two-star admiral in the United States Navy. I have commanded fleets in combat zones while you were probably learning to tie your shoes. I will not be lectured about security protocols by some civilian rent-a-cop who thinks she can play soldier with a clipboard and a radio." The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond a simple administrative dispute. This had become personal, ugly, a powerful man using his authority to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back. Elena stood her ground, her voice never rising, never wavering, professional to the core despite the public assault on her competence and dignity. "Admiral, I understand your frustration, but my responsibility is to base security, not to personal convenience. The credential verification is nearly complete. If you'll allow me just another moment to confirm with the command post." "That's enough," Harrison roared, his face now completely flushed with fury. He turned to address the entire plaza, his voice carrying to every corner of the ceremony grounds. "This is exactly what's wrong with modern military contracting. We hire unqualified civilians to handle critical functions, then wonder why nothing gets done efficiently." He pointed directly at Elena, his gesture theatrical and deliberately humiliating. "This woman has just demonstrated that she is completely unsuited for any position requiring judgment, initiative, or common sense. She would rather follow meaningless bureaucratic procedures than facilitate legitimate military operations." The murmurs from the crowd were growing louder now, a mixture of embarrassment for Elena and shock at Harrison's public display of cruelty. Some officers looked away, uncomfortable with witnessing such a one-sided destruction of someone who couldn't defend herself without losing her job. Harrison wasn't finished. He walked closer to Elena, close enough that she could see the veins standing out on his neck, close enough that his voice became a low, venomous whisper that still carried to the near spectators. "Your contract with this base is terminated immediately. You will surrender your credentials, collect your personal belongings, and be escorted off this installation within the hour. You are no longer authorized to be on Marine Corps property. Is that perfectly clear?" The plaza fell completely silent. Even the ceremony proceedings had stopped, as everyone realized they were witnessing the professional execution of a security contractor who had committed no crime other than doing her job exactly as she'd been trained to do it. Elena looked at Admiral Harrison for a long moment, her expression calm despite the public humiliation being heaped upon her. Then she nodded once, a slight inclination of her head that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and dignity in the face of his cruelty. "Understood, Admiral. I'll collect my equipment and report to the duty officer for checkout procedures." She began to turn away, moving with the same quiet professionalism she displayed throughout the confrontation, when the sound of tortured metal filled the air. The massive sound system tower, positioned on a hydraulic lift near the main stage, had been straining under wind loads all morning. Now, as Elena took her first steps away from the security checkpoint, a critical support cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The entire structure, weighing several tons and loaded with speakers, lights, and electronic equipment, began its inexorable fall toward the packed bleachers where hundreds of military families sat watching the ceremony. In that instant, everything changed. The petty power struggle over security procedures became irrelevant. Elena's public humiliation became meaningless. All that mattered was the falling tower and the lives that hung in the balance. And in that moment of crisis, Elena Martinez stopped being a security contractor and became who she had always been underneath. Captain Ghost Martinez stepped forward into history, her voice cutting through panic like a blade forged in combat. The evacuation she commanded saved every life in those bleachers. The leadership she displayed reminded everyone present that true authority comes not from rank or title, but from competence under pressure. When the dust settled and the danger passed, it was Captain Rodriguez who stepped forward to salute her, followed by every Marine in the plaza, followed finally by Admiral Harrison himself. The story spread across Quantico within hours, then across the Marine Corps, then throughout the military community worldwide. It became a legend about assumptions and appearances, about the heroes who walk among us wearing civilian clothes and carrying the quiet dignity of service without recognition. Elena never sought the attention her story brought. She continued her work, continued her quiet service, continued to honor those who serve by serving herself. But she never had to hide again. The world had seen Captain Ghost Martinez, and that sight changed how everyone looked at the people around them. Admiral Harrison's report to his superiors was brief and honest. He recommended Elena for immediate reinstatement to active duty with full honors. He also requested a formal review of his own conduct, acknowledging that his behavior had been unworthy of his rank and position. The investigation that followed led to significant changes in how civilian contractors were treated throughout the military system. More importantly, it reinforced a fundamental truth that should never have needed reinforcing. Honor doesn't wear a uniform. Courage doesn't require recognition. Leadership doesn't need permission. The greatest heroes often wear the plainest clothes and ask for nothing more than the chance to serve. Captain Elena Ghost Martinez proved that day that legends don't retire. They just change uniforms and continue their mission in ways the world doesn't expect but desperately needs. 6 months later, Elena was offered a position as Senior Aviation Safety Coordinator for the entire Marine Corps, a role that would utilize her extensive flight experience while allowing her to continue the quiet, essential work she preferred. She accepted, not for the recognition or the advancement, but because it was another way to serve, another way to protect the men and women who put their lives on the line every day. On her first day in the new position, Admiral Harrison stopped by her office. Not to apologize again, they had moved past that, but to thank her for a lesson in humility he would carry for the rest of his career. Elena looked up from her desk, smiled slightly, and returned to the safety report she was reviewing. Because that's who she was. Someone who got back to work while others talked about the work that needed to be done. The plaza at Quantico was eventually renamed Martinez Plaza in her honor, though Elena herself was not present for the dedication ceremony. She was busy that day, conducting a safety inspection at a training facility, making sure young Marines would come home safe from their exercises. Because legends don't attend ceremonies about themselves. They're too busy being legendary. The memorial plaque reads simply, Captain Elena Martinez, United States Marine Corps. Call sign Ghost. She served with honor. Still does. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope to do. To serve with honor, whether anyone is watching or not, whether anyone knows our name or not, whether we wear stars on our shoulders or carry mops in our hands. True service doesn't need applause. It just needs to be done. Captain Ghost Martinez proved that. Every single day,